Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to take your sources, dig into them, and really pull out the key insights so you can be genuinely well-informed. Today, we're diving into something that's been causing quite a stir across South Asia: India's recent decision on the Indus Waters Treaty. And this isn't just about water, is it? It's history, security, economics, international law, all tangled up.
Absolutely. It's a fascinating deep dive because, well, this treaty, the IWT, it's been around for over 60 years. It's honestly been a pretty remarkable example of cooperation, considering the hostility between India and Pakistan. It survived wars, major conflicts.
Right.
But now, India putting it in abeyance, that's new territory, raises huge questions about, the treaty's future, regional stability, the whole lot.
So, okay, let's break it down. What exactly is this treaty? Why now? And what does abeyance really mean in this context? Let's unpack it. Okay, let's start with the basics, lay the foundation. The Indus Waters Treaty, or IWT, what is it and why was it even created back in 1960?
Right, so the IWT was signed September 19th, 1960. You had India's Prime Minister Nehru and Pakistan's President Ayub Khan. And it was brokered, importantly, by the World Bank. It took years of negotiation.
And the goal?
The main goal was to sort out how to share the waters of the Indus Basin, 6 major rivers. These rivers are absolutely vital. I mean, lifeblood, kind of vital for farming, drinking water industry, everything for both countries. The real urgency came after partition in 1947. Suddenly, the border cut right through this massive integrated irrigation system.
So Pakistan ended up downstream?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Pakistan, as the lower riparian, suddenly found the headwaters of its main rivers were in India. Huge vulnerability. There's a real fear of conflict over water, a water war. The treaty was basically designed to stop that from happening.
Okay, so how did it divide the waters? I hear it wasn't exactly an even split.
No, definitely not 50-50. It's quite unique, actually. It didn't just divide the water volume proportionally. It sort of partitioned the rivers themselves. So you have the eastern rivers, Ravi, Beas, and Sutlej. India got exclusive, unrestricted use of these.
Okay. And how much water is that, roughly?
It's about 41 billion cubic meters a year, which sounds like a lot. And it is, but it's only about 19.5% of the total annual volume of the whole basin.
Right, only about a fifth.
Then you have the western rivers, the Indus itself, the Jhelum, and the Chenab. Pakistan got control over almost all the water from these.
And that's the bulk of it.
Oh, yeah. About 70% of the total water, around 99 billion cubic meters. Specifically, it works out to 80.5%. That's 5,900 trillion cubic feet of the basin's total annual volume. So it was a massive concession to Pakistan. India ended up with only about 21% of the total water, even though a larger part of the basin geographically is in India.
Wow. So from the start, India felt it was generous, maybe too generous.
Generous is one word. Many in India, even back then and certainly now, saw it as heavily skewed in Pakistan's favor.
But India still had some rights on those western rivers, right? It wasn't totally hands-off.
Correct. And this is where a lot of the later problems started. India is allowed limited agricultural use and, importantly, non-consumptive uses on the western rivers.
Non-consumptive meaning?
Primarily generating hydroelectric power. Run-of-the-river projects, basically.
So using the flow, but not storing or diverting large amounts.
Exactly. But, and this is key, the treaty laid down incredibly detailed, very strict rules for any projects India wanted to build on those rivers. It specifically banned any diversions or constructions that would significantly affect Pakistan's downstream flow. Large storage dams were mostly out unless they met really stringent criteria.
Sounds complicated.
It is. And to manage all this, they set up the Permanent Indus Commission, the PIC.
Okay.
They're supposed to meet every year, share data on river flows, inspect sites, monitor compliance. Standard stuff for treaties like this.
And if they disagreed, which sounds likely.
Yeah, disagreements were frequent. So there's a 3-step dispute process. First, the PIC tries to sort it out. If that fails, it can go to a neutral expert, usually appointed by the World Bank.
And the final step?
A formal court of arbitration for the really big, complex legal disputes. So the mechanisms were there, but, using them often just highlighted the disagreements.
It's still pretty amazing it survived, though. Hailed as a success story, surviving multiple wars between India and Pakistan, that's quite something.
It absolutely is. Its resilience is genuinely remarkable. Think about it, the 1965 war, the 1971 war, even the Kargil conflict in 1999, the treaty held.
Water kept flowing.
Largely, yes. Water kept flowing. The treaty's preamble even talks about goodwill, friendship, and cooperation. It's often held up as proof that cooperation is possible even between bitter rivals, especially on shared resources, a kind of beacon.
But there's always a but. Despite that resilience, India clearly had issues. Major concerns about fairness, how it worked in practice. Where did this dissatisfaction come from?
You're right, the resilience is one side. India's deep-seated grievances are the other. From India's point of view, many see the treaty as fundamentally unfair and just incredibly inflexible. You have figures like Dilip Sinha, a former diplomat, arguing pretty forcefully that no other country in India's position, an upper riparian state, has ever given away such a huge chunk of its water resources.
Really? No other examples like this?
He points to China with the Brahmaputra or Turkey with the Tigris and Euphrates. They're upstream too, but they've flatly refused similar agreements that would give downstream countries so much control. So India feels it got a uniquely bad deal in 1960.
So it wasn't just the water split itself, but how India felt constrained in using even the water it did control, or the limited rights on the western rivers.
Precisely. It's both the unequal division and the operational headaches. Rahul Bhandari, writing for the Hindustan Times, pointed out that the allocation ignored things like population size or how much land each country cultivates using that water.
Metrics that might have favored India more.
Exactly. By India's calculations using those metrics, they argue they should be entitled to something like 42.8% of the water, not just 21%. So there's that baseline unfairness argument. But then there's the operational side. India feels Pakistan has consistently used an obstructionist approach. Meaning Pakistan objects to practically every single project India tries to build on the western rivers, even the small run-of-the-river hydro projects permitted under the treaty.
Like Salal Baglihar. Those names come up a lot.
Salal Babler, Kishanga, Radal, the list goes on. Every project triggers objections from Pakistan, often leading to long delays, costly international arbitration processes. India argues this effectively stops them from using even the limited rights they do have under the treaty, especially hurting development in Jammu and Kashmir where these rivers flow.
So this frustration built up over decades.
Absolutely. It's led to growing calls within India from politicians, experts, even state governments like Jammu and Kashmir's for a complete overhaul, a full-scale revision or abrogation of the treaty. Omar Abdullah, when he was chief minister of J&K, famously called it the most unfair document for his state, blaming it for hindering everything from farming to flood control to power generation.
Okay, so we have this treaty resilient, yes, but viewed as deeply flawed by India. Decades of simmering frustration. What was the actual spark? What finally pushed it over the edge right now?
The immediate trigger, the event that seemed to break the camel's back, was a major terrorist attack near Pahalgam in Kashmir. That was April 22nd, 2025. 26 people were killed, including tourists. It was a brutal attack.
And India's reaction linked it directly to Pakistan.
Immediately and explicitly, India blamed cross-border terrorism, alleging direct support complicity from Pakistan. For India, this wasn't just one event in isolation. They see it as the latest in a long pattern. Mumbai, 2008, Uri, 2016, Pulwama, 2019.
Right.
So, this Pahalgam attack, following that history, seems to have exhausted India's patience regarding cooperation under the IWT. It became the catalyst for action.
And the response from the top was very direct. Prime Minister Modi's comments were widely reported.
Extremely direct. Almost immediately, Prime Minister Modi's first public statement on the issue was stark. India's water belongs to India now. A very clear signal.
Wow.
Then the very next day, April 23rd, 2025, the Indian government formally declared the treaty suspended.
Okay, and the justification?
Officially, they cited national security concerns stemming from the attack and demanded that Pakistan credibly and irrevocably abjure its support for cross-border terrorism. It directly echoed what Modi said after the Uri attack back in 2016. Blood and water cannot flow together. That phrase really framed their position.
Yeah, that phrase stuck.
It essentially made cooperation on water conditional on Pakistan, stopping what India sees as state-sponsored terrorism. A direct link was drawn.
Okay, let's talk about this word, abeyance. It's really specific. India didn't say terminate or withdraw. They said abeyance. Why that word? What's the strategy there?
That choice of word is absolutely crucial. It's very deliberate, very calculated. As one analysis from ORF put it, it's strategic legal statecraft.
Okay, unpack that. Strategic legal statecraft.
It means India isn't formally tearing up the treaty or withdrawing from it completely. That would be a clear, unambiguous breach. Instead, they've paused procedural cooperation. Things like the annual PIC meetings, sharing data, joint inspections, using the formal dispute mechanisms. Those are on hold.
But not the water allocation itself.
Not directly, not yet. The ORF piece summed it up well. India has neither withdrawn from the treaty nor altered river flows, but paused procedural cooperation using law, not water, for leverage.
Ah, okay. So it's pressure applied through the treaty's mechanisms, or lack thereof now.
Yeah. Exactly. It's a diplomatic power play using legal tools. New Delhi is essentially saying, we won't engage in the cooperative parts of this treaty until you address our core security concerns about terrorism. It's framed as a calibrated form of legal restraint, a response to what India calls long-standing, unaddressed, wrongful state-sponsored act of terrorism.
So it leaves the door open, potentially. The treaty could be revived if Pakistan acts.
That's the implicit message, yes. The hope from India's side is that this pressure forces a change in Pakistan's behavior, allowing the treaty's cooperative elements to resume later. It's a signal that treaties need mutual good faith and reciprocity to work. India is arguing that, from their perspective, that good faith has been broken by Pakistan's alleged actions. It's definitely testing the limits.
Right. So the legal side. The immediate reaction, as you mentioned, was that the treaty itself doesn't actually mention suspension. It says it stays in force until replaced by another treaty.
That's correct. Article 12.2 is pretty clear on that.
So on the face of it, putting it in abeyance looks like India just stepping outside the rules.
Well, that's the core of the legal debate. Looking strictly at the text of the IWT, there's no clause for unilateral suspension or abeyance. And if you look at general international treaty law, codified in the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, the VCLT.
Which sets the rules for treaties globally.
Broadly, yes. The VCLT doesn't formally recognize abeyance either. It talks about termination or suspension, but usually requires mutual consent or specific grounds like a material breach by the other party or impossibility of performance. And importantly, the VCLT deliberately tends to exclude political tensions or even armed conflict as automatic grounds for suspending treaty obligations.
So based on the treaty text and the VCLT, it looks legally shaky for India.
From a purely textualist reading, yes, it presents challenges. But India's justification doesn't rely solely on the IWT text.
Okay, so how does India justify it legally? What's their main argument?
Their primary legal argument hinges on Article 62 of the Vienna Convention. This article covers something called fundamental change of circumstances, or the doctrine of rebus extantibus in legal Latin.
Okay, fundamental change. What does that mean here?
It means if circumstances have changed so drastically and fundamentally since the treaty was signed, in ways that were not foreseen, and if those changes radically transform the extent of obligations still to be performed, then a state might be able to withdraw or suspend the treaty. India argues that the rise of persistent state-sponsored cross-border terrorism originating from Pakistan constitutes such a fundamental, unforeseen change.
So terrorism changes the whole basis on which the treaty was agreed.
That's the argument. Pradeep Kumar Saxena, India's former Indus commissioner, explicitly made this link. He said, sustained terrorism creates security uncertainties that fundamentally undermine the basis of consent and cooperation envisaged in 1960. The context, India argues, is completely different now.
But hang on, isn't there a catch? India hasn't actually ratified the Vienna Convention, right? How can they invoke an article from a treaty they aren't formally party to?
That's a really sharp point, and it's definitely part of the counter-argument against India's position. You're right, India isn't a signatory. However, India's stance is that many VCLT provisions, including Article 62 on fundamental change, reflect customary international law.
Meaning they're binding on all states anyway, ratified or not, because they represent established state practice.
Exactly. That's the argument. India says it follows these principles as customary law, or sometimes adopts VCLT rules as guidelines when convenient. They accept the basic principle pacta sunt servanda treaties must be kept in good faith. But they argue it's not absolute. It can be overridden by other doctrines like necessity or, crucially, countermeasures.
Okay, countermeasures. You mentioned that before. How does India frame this abeyance as a lawful countermeasure?
Right. This is another key pillar of their legal justification. They argue their action isn't a breach of the treaty, but a lawful response to a prior breach by Pakistan. Under international law, countermeasures are basically unilateral, non-forcible actions an injured state can take against a state that's breaching international law to get them to stop.
So India sees Pakistan's alleged support for terrorism as the initial breach.
Yes. That's the alleged internationally wrongful act by Pakistan. India's suspension of procedural cooperation under the IWT is then presented as the countermeasure, designed to induce Pakistan to stop supporting terrorism.
But there are rules for countermeasures, right? They can't just be punitive.
Absolutely. Crucial conditions apply. They must be proportionate to the original wrong. They must be reversible, meaning if Pakistan complies, the countermeasure, the suspension, can be lifted. And their aim must be to induce compliance, not just punish.
So India argues pausing cooperation but not stopping water flow fits these criteria.
Precisely. They argue it's a measured, temporary response. By focusing on procedural aspects, data sharing, meetings, inspections, and not altering the fundamental water allocations, they claim it's proportionate and reversible. It targets the cooperative framework, which relies on good faith, which they argue Pakistan has violated. It's a nuanced legal argument differentiating their action from, say, building a huge dam overnight in violation of the treaty.
Has anything like this happened before? Are there precedents for this kind of abeyance or treaty suspension based on changed circumstances or as a countermeasure?
It's relatively rare and always legally debatable, but yes, there are some precedents states might point to. The ORF analysis mentions a few. Like in 1986, the U.S. suspended security obligations to New Zealand under the ANZ-US treaty after New Zealand banned nuclear ships. The U.S. cited changed circumstances.
Okay.
Closer to this situation, perhaps, India itself suspended water sharing with Bangladesh over the Farakka barrage back in the 70s, effectively stopping flows until a new deal was negotiated. That was quite unilateral.
Right.
And very recently, in 2023, the U.S. used the term lawful countermeasures regarding the New START treaty with Russia. They stopped sharing certain data but kept the main warhead limits, calling it a partial, reversible response to Russian noncompliance on inspections.
So while maybe not identical, there are examples of states taking unilateral action on treaties, citing similar justifications.
Yes. These examples show that states sometimes do temporarily suspend parts of treaty obligations, framing it as a response to breaches or changed circumstances, operating in that legally gray area.
So wrapping up the legal angle from India's viewpoint, it's not arbitrary, but a strategic move framed using doctrines like fundamental change and countermeasures, arguing Pakistan's actions broke the good faith required for the treaty.
Exactly. India presents it as moving from just passively complying with the treaty to actively stewarding it, asserting that cooperation requires reciprocity and can't continue unchanged in the face of what it sees as persistent hostility and breaches of international law like state-sponsored terrorism.
Yeah.
It's a bold legal stance for sure.
Okay, let's move from the legal arguments to the practical actions. Beyond the declaration of abeyance, what did India actually do on the ground immediately afterwards?
Well, the actions were quite swift and noticeable. Following the announcement, India's National Hydroelectric Power Corporation closed all the gates at two key dams on the Chenab River, Baglahar, and Salal.
The Chenab being one of the western rivers primarily allocated to Pakistan.
Precisely. Now, the official reason given was optimizing water carrying capacity after some routine flushing operations. Standard maintenance, they might say.
But the timing.
The timing was critical. It coincided with Pakistan's Kharif planting season, a period when water demand is high for crops like rice and cotton. So, closing the gates, even temporarily, reportedly caused significant alarm, even panic, downstream in Pakistan.
So even if framed as maintenance, it immediately reduced water flow at a sensitive time.
That's the assessment from experts like A.K. Bajad, former head of India's Central Water Commission. He confirmed it was reducing flow, and there were even photos showing parts of the riverbed near Jammu drying up. And this reservoir flushing itself is interesting. Under the treaty, refilling reservoirs after flushing usually happens during the peak monsoon in August to minimize impact on Pakistan.
But now, with the treaty in abeyance,
India feels it can do it whenever it chooses, even during Pakistan's crucial sowing season. This change in operational procedure in itself becomes a form of leverage.
Okay, so those were immediate actions. Looking ahead, what does abeyance potentially free India up to do? What are the bigger, more strategic actions they could now take?
This is where the abeyance really bites from Pakistan's perspective. India essentially argues it's no longer bound by many of the treaty's restrictions on the western rivers. This could allow several major shifts. First, stopping data sharing and inspections. This is huge. India shared real-time river flow data, flood warnings. That could stop. Pakistan would be flying blind, vulnerable to sudden floods or shortages.
And no more inspections by Pakistani officials.
Correct. India could block those, which were mandatory before. Less transparency, less ability for Pakistan to verify what India is doing upstream. Second, fast-tracking infrastructure on western rivers. Remember those restrictions on large storage dams? India now feels those technical shackles are gone.
So bigger dams are now on the table.
Potentially, yes. Projects like the Pahalgam Dam, which has significant storage potential, could be accelerated, or the Uja Dam project in J&K, which also involves storage. These were heavily contested by Pakistan before. Third, and perhaps most significantly, diverting water. This is the big one. India might now seriously explore building canals or infrastructure to divert water from the western rivers.
Away from Pakistan towards India's own drier regions, like Punjab, Rajasthan.
Exactly. Or even diverting it into India's eastern rivers to augment their flow. Any large-scale diversion would drastically reduce the water flowing into Pakistan. That would be a massive strategic shift. Fourth, continuing to maximize use of the eastern rivers. India was already doing this, but Abeyance removes any residual Pakistani objections or perceived constraints. Projects like the Chaparkhandi Dam on the Ravi are key here.
Didn't India recently stop Ravi water flowing to Pakistan entirely?
Yes, on March 1st, 2025, after completing the Chaparkhandi Dam project, India officially stopped the Ravi flow that used to go to Pakistan, diverting it for its own use in Punjab and J&K. That was after decades of delays. Abeyance reinforces this trend. Fifth, potentially better flood control in Kashmir. With fewer restrictions on storage on the Jhelum, for instance, India could build infrastructure to manage floods better in the Kashmir Valley, a benefit for its own population. And finally, ignoring Pakistan's objections. In the past, almost every Indian project faced objections, delays, arbitration. Now, India feels it's under no obligation to even consider Pakistan's concerns for new projects, like those hydropower plants in Ladakh. They could just proceed.
It really sounds like India is setting the stage to massively increase its control and leverage over the water flows, even if, as you say, they can't literally turn off the taps overnight.
That's exactly the assessment. The existing dams don't have the capacity to stop water for long periods, maybe just days. Building the really big storage dams and diversion canals needed for major long-term impact would take years, maybe decades, and huge investment.
The Pahalgam project, for instance.
Right, that's still maybe 3-4 years away from having significant storage capacity. Major canal projects would take even longer, but the intent is clear. Suspending cooperation, accelerating existing projects, planning new ones. It all signals a long-term strategy to build that leverage, piece by piece, putting immense, sustained pressure on Pakistan. It's a strategic game changer.
So let's flip the perspective. If India does pursue these actions, less data, more dams, potential diversions, what's the real-world impact on Pakistan? They're downstream, heavily reliant.
The impact could be devastating. Pakistan's vulnerability here is extreme. Its entire economy, its society, is fundamentally tied to the Indus system. Think about this. About 80% of Pakistan's farmland, that's around 16 million hectares, depends on Indus irrigation.
80%?
Yes, and agriculture supports over 60% of their population, contributes about a quarter of their GDP. Key crops, wheat, rice, sugarcane, cotton, it all relies on that water.
So any disruption hits them incredibly hard.
Incredibly hard. Reduced flow, or even just unpredictable fluctuations, could lead to severe water shortages. That means lower crop yields, potential food shortages, massive economic damage.
What kind of specific threats are we talking about?
Well, widespread water scarcity is the big one. Less water for irrigation directly hits food production. It could trigger food shortages and drive up prices, hurting the poorest most. The economic impact would be huge, crippling the agricultural sector and having knock-on effects across the economy, which is already fragile. Then there's hydropower. Pakistan gets nearly 30% of its electricity from big dams on the Indus system, like Tarbela and Mangala. Reduced flows mean less power, leading to blackouts, hurting industry and daily life.
And their storage capacity. Can they buffer against changes?
That's another problem. Pakistan has very limited water storage capacity compared to India. Maybe enough for only 30 days of flow, while India has much more. So they're much more vulnerable to sudden upstream changes. They can't easily ride out a prolonged reduction. And beyond the direct impacts, you worry about social unrest. Water scarcity fuels tensions. It can lead to internal migration as people leave dry areas, and it can worsen existing conflicts over water within Pakistan itself.
And the environmental side. Altering a river system this massive must have ecological consequences too.
Absolutely. Ecologists are very concerned. Building more large dams and diversions in the Himalayas, a young and fragile mountain range, could cause irreversible damage to ecosystems. Fish populations, river health, biodiversity are all at risk. And for Pakistan, if surface water reduces, the temptation is to pump more groundwater.
Which is already stressed.
Exactly. Overpumping leads to falling water tables, land subsidence, and increased salinity in the soil, making land unusable for farming in the long run. The Indus Delta downstream also suffers, with less freshwater flow leading to saltwater intrusion from the sea. It's a cascade of potential environmental problems on top of the economic and social ones.
How has Pakistan officially reacted, and what does this mean for the wider region?
Pakistan's reaction has been, understandably, one of alarm and strong condemnation. There have been reports of warnings that any Indian attempt to actually stop the flow could be seen as an act of war.
Strong words.
Very strong, reflecting how existential this is for them. Some reports even mention the nuclear dimension, which shows the extreme sensitivity. Diplomatically, Pakistan is certain to raise this in every international forum possible. The UN, potentially trying to involve the World Bank again, accusing India of weaponizing water and violating international norms. It sets the stage for a major international dispute.
You mentioned the World Bank. They brokered the treaty. Are they stepping in?
Their official stance so far has been quite cautious. They've said their role under the treaty is limited mainly to facilitating the dispute resolution process. Since India has suspended participation in that process, the bank stated it would not intervene in the current suspension dispute itself.
So Pakistan can't really count on the World Bank to pressure India right now.
It seems unlikely, at least not directly compelling India to reverse the abeyance. This limits Pakistan's immediate options for external leverage.
And internally, does this crisis worsen Pakistan's own water politics?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Pakistan already has serious internal conflicts over water sharing, especially between Punjab, the upper province, and Sindh, the lower province on the Indus plain.
Sindh often complains Punjab takes too much.
Constantly. These disputes are deeply political and have caused unrest for decades. India's actions upstream will only intensify these internal pressures and make managing water within Pakistan even more difficult and contentious. It adds fuel to an existing fire.
It really paints a picture of water as this critical nexus of security, stability, and survival in South Asia.
It couldn't be clearer. It shows how a dispute over a shared resource, especially one as vital as water, can rapidly escalate, threatening peace, economic stability, and the well-being of millions. It's a high-stakes situation with potentially dire consequences.
We've talked about the treaty's history, the current crisis, but the treaty itself is from 1960. The world's changed. How do those bigger changes, things beyond just India-Pakistan relations, affect this treaty now?
That's a crucial point. The 1960 treaty was designed for a different world, and it's struggling to cope with 21st century realities. The biggest elephant in the room is climate change.
How does that specifically impact the Indus?
The Himalayan glaciers feeding the Indus system are melting faster than expected. This messes with water flows dramatically. Short term, you might get more meltwater, causing bigger floods. But long term, as the glaciers shrink, the base flow of the rivers will decrease, leading to potentially severe water scarcity, especially during dry seasons.
So the source itself is changing.
Exactly. And add to that more erratic monsoon patterns, bigger floods one year, intense droughts the next. It makes water management incredibly difficult and unpredictable. NASA has called the Indus Basin one of the world's most overstressed water systems. The original treaty just has no real mechanisms to deal with climate change adaptation, managing glacier melt, or handling increased climate variability. It's silent on these massive issues.
So the whole environmental context is fundamentally different from 1960.
Completely. And the geopolitical context, too. The institutions that brokered it, like the World Bank, operate differently now. Their leverage and approach have evolved. And India sees itself very differently. It feels it's in a much stronger position economically and diplomatically than it was in 1960, less constrained by post-colonial dynamics. It believes it can and should negotiate a better deal now. The 1960 framework feels outdated from their perspective.
So given all this, the history, the abeyance, the climate pressure, is renegotiation the only way forward? Is it even possible?
Well, India has been formally pushing for renegotiation for a while. They sent that notice to Pakistan back in January 2023.
Citing lack of cooperation from Pakistan.
Yes, accusing Pakistan of actions against the spirit and objective of the treaty. They sent another request in September 2024. So India's intent to revise the treaty is very clear. They want changes.
Likely wanting more flexibility, more rights on the Western rivers.
Presumably, yes. More storage capacity, perhaps linking water explicitly to security issues. They want terms that reflect today's power balance and their needs.
And Pakistan's position on renegotiation. As the downstream state, they must be wary.
Extremely wary. Pakistan's consistent stance is that they want to adhere to the procedures stipulated in the IWT. They emphasize they cannot take risk of abrogating IWT.
Meaning they want to stick with the current treaty and its dispute mechanisms.
Essentially, yes. For Pakistan, the existing treaty, despite its flaws, provides a guaranteed baseline of water security backed by international law. Opening it up for renegotiation from a position of perceived weakness is incredibly risky for them. They fear losing the guarantees they currently have.
So we have India pushing for change, Pakistan resisting. The future looks incredibly uncertain. Can this treaty actually be saved, or is this abeyance the start of a permanent shift towards conflict over water?
That really is the billion-dollar question, isn't it? The treaty's resilience has been legendary, but this abeyance move by India is a genuine paradigm shift. It's India signaling that the old rules, the old assumptions of good faith and reciprocity no longer apply from their perspective, given the security situation. Whether it can be salvaged likely depends on intense dialogue, maybe quiet diplomacy, perhaps facilitated by a third party both sides trust, though finding one is difficult. Without that, the risk is very high that this strategic pause becomes permanent, leading to a much more confrontational era of water management, constant friction, and heightened instability in a region that really can't afford it.
It's been a truly fascinating and frankly quite sobering deep dive. The Indus Waters Treaty, it was the symbol of cooperation against the odds, and now it's right at the heart of these escalating tensions. India's abeyance move is clearly a powerful signal.
It really throws into sharp relief how tangled water resources are with everything else: national security, economic survival, international law, and this idea of abeyance as a legal tactic combined with the massive environmental pressures from climate change. It really highlights the incredibly high stakes here.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we finish up, here's something to think about. We live in a world facing more climate change, more resource scarcity, more geopolitical tension. How might this strategic pause on the Indus, this challenge to a 60-year-old water agreement, influence how other countries handle their shared rivers in the future? Does it set a precedent, good or bad? It definitely leaves us with a lot to consider about the future of water diplomacy, not just in South Asia, but everywhere.